My brother's face went white the morning the preservation notice landed on the podium at his groundbreaking. He had 60 investors watching. I had a brass measuring tape in my coat pocket. Let me back up 15 years. Your work is just a joke. That is what my mother said every time I mentioned what I did for a living. My brother got the investment capital. I got a research grant. His name meant something in this city. Mine meant old buildings. Then Grandma Frances died. My brother sold her house without a single call to me. I found out through a LinkedIn post. The morning I saw it, I drove to the Chatham County Courthouse. I had read hundreds of probate files. This one had my grandmother's name on it. And one clause nobody had followed. My name is Clara Hensley. I document historic properties for a living. I know what a right of first refusal clause means. If you've ever been called a joke, stay with me. My father died when I was 22, and Devin was 27. He had a stroke on a Tuesday afternoon and was gone by Wednesday morning. My mother handled everything after that, which is a sentence that sounds like a tribute, but was actually just accurate. Patricia Hensley handled things. She had always handled things. My father had been the softer one, the one who laughed at dinner and asked how your day was and remembered to ask again the next week. After he died, the house ran on Patricia's logistics and not much else. I was finishing my undergraduate thesis on antebellum residential architecture in coastal Georgia. Devin was getting his MBA at Georgia Tech on a scholarship that my mother had spent 2 years helping him apply for. That was the shape of the family at that point. Devin was the direction all the momentum was pointing. I was the other thing. I want to be clear about something. My mother was not a cruel woman. She was a practical one. She had looked at 2 children and assessed their situations the way she assessed everything, which was, what is the realistic outcome here, and what resources do we need to allocate toward it? Devin had a business plan. Devin had a network. Devon had a 5-year projection that he had actually written down on paper and showed her over dinner. I had a thesis on porch column design and a list of phone numbers from my dissertation advisor. She chose where to put the weight. I cannot say it was irrational. I can say it accumulated. Devon opened Hensley Development 4 years after our father died. He had been working at a commercial real estate firm in Atlanta, building relationships, learning the industry. My mother had served as an informal advisor throughout. When he came back to Savannah to start the company, she became a founding co-investor. The conversations about the company happened at the dining room table I had grown up at. I was not invited to those conversations. Not because anyone said you are not welcome, but because no one said you should be here. The distinction matters. There is a kind of exclusion that requires no malice. It runs on assumption. The first time I asked about it, my mother said, she chose her path, we chose ours. She said it without any particular emphasis, the way you state a geographical fact. Clara is in Savannah doing the preservation work. Devin is building something. These are different tracks. This seemed obvious to her. It seemed like something else to me. I did not argue. I had learned early that arguing with Patricia required more energy than I usually had after a full day of fieldwork, and the result was almost always the same anyway. What I found was that the longer I did not argue, the more invisible the track became. After a while, you stop seeing the gap as a wound. You start to see it as just the shape of things. Frances was my grandmother on my father's side. She had lived at 14 Abercorn Street in Savannah's historic district for 41 years in a Greek Revival house built in 1856 that she and my grandfather had bought in 1983 when the neighborhood was not yet fashionable and the price reflected that. My grandfather died in 2009. Frances stayed. Frances got sick in the spring of the year Devin started his company. It was slow at first, the way those things are. A tiredness that becomes a diagnosis, that becomes a schedule of appointments. She kept living in the house. She did not want to leave the house. Everyone in the family understood this and worked around it in different ways. Devin sent money when he could, called on Sundays. I drove over on weekends. This was not presented as a sacrifice, and I did not experience it as one. I liked Frances. I liked the house. I had spent part of every summer there as a child, learning the neighborhood, learning to read the ironwork on the front gates, learning which houses had been altered and which had been left alone. Frances had an eye for that kind of thing. She had opinions about what had been done right and what had been done carelessly, and she stated them directly, which I respected. On those weekend visits, I would let myself in with the spare key she kept under the third porch step and make coffee and sit with her for whatever the morning allowed. Sometimes she was tired. Sometimes she was sharp and full of commentary about the neighborhood association meeting she had just attended. On the good days, we walked. She was the one who taught me to use a measuring tape properly, not the flexible cloth kind, but a rigid brass one, the kind that survives decades of field use. She had one that had belonged to a local craftsman she had known in the 1970s. It was engraved on the side, Frances H., 1971. She had not explained how she came to own it. She had simply handed it to me one afternoon when I was about 14, and we were checking whether the front door was warping. She said, "Pull it tight at both ends. If it gives, it's done. If it holds, you have something to work with." I had been using a version of that logic in my work ever since. In those years, when I was going to the house on weekends, I learned things I did not know I was learning. I learned how to read the grain of old-growth pine flooring and tell whether it had been laid in the original construction or replaced. I learned how to identify the ghost marks left by removed architectural elements, the shadows on plaster where a mantelpiece had stood, the outlines on floors where partition walls had been. I learned that a building tells a continuous story if you know how to look, and that most people do not look because looking requires slowing down in a way that modern life does not naturally accommodate. Frances had given me the tools for this, literally and otherwise. The measuring tape was the literal one. The otherwise was harder to name, but had to do with a habit of attention, a conviction that the thing in front of you deserved to be fully seen before you decided what to do about it. My mother did not have this habit. My mother was efficient. She processed incoming information and made decisions and moved forward. This is a valuable quality. It had kept the family functional after my father died and had allowed Devon to build something real. I did not resent it in her. I had spent enough time in professional settings to know that people who can make decisions and keep moving are essential. The difficulty was that some things require the slower approach, need to be measured twice. The gap between Patricia and me had grown during those years by accumulation, the way gaps do. It was not a single argument. It was a long series of small asymmetries that none of us ever named directly. Devon's company was a topic at family dinners. My work was a detail, mentioned briefly when directly asked, and then moved past. Devon's professional relationships were nurtured and attended. Mine were noted without particular interest. When Devon had a difficult client situation, my mother called to ask how it was going. When I had a difficult preservation review, no one called. None of this was deliberate cruelty. I want to be clear about that, because clarity matters here. Patricia was not a woman who set out to diminish her daughter. She was a woman who had allocated her attention according to what she believed was most important, and had not realized that allocation was itself a message. Or perhaps she had realized it and considered it an honest representation of her priorities. I cannot fully know which. I only know what it felt like from where I was standing. My mother noticed that I was spending weekends at Frances's house. She told a neighbor once, when I was nearby and she did not realize it. Clara has time for that kind of thing because she hasn't got a family of her own yet. She said it the way you explain a fact about geography. Clara lives close by. Clara doesn't have the other obligations. It was not unkind exactly. It was the kind of thing that is said in the absence of cruelty and still lands the same way. Frances died in March. It was quiet, the way she had wanted it. She had been clear about that. No extended intervention, no extraordinary measures, just the hospice nurses and the house and whoever was willing to stay. I was there for the last 11 days. Devon came twice. Patricia came when she could. The morning after Frances died, my mother called me. She said, "The estate is complicated. We'll handle it." I said, "Okay, when is the will reading?" She said, "We'll let you know." 3 weeks later, I asked again. My mother said, "You were in the middle of that survey project. I didn't want to interrupt." I had not been in the middle of any survey project. I had been available. I had, in fact, rearranged 2 client meetings to keep time open for family matters. I did not say this. I asked when I could review the documents. My mother said she would send me what she had. She sent me a 2-page summary that did not include the actual will. I did not push further. This is the thing I have thought about since. I did not push further, and so I did not know. The LinkedIn notification came on a Tuesday evening in October. I was eating dinner alone at my kitchen table, the way I usually did on weekdays. My phone was face up next to my plate, and the notification appeared. Hensley Development is proud to announce our newest project, 14 Abercorn Street, a thoughtfully reimagined luxury residence in Savannah's most iconic historic neighborhood. There was a rendering attached. It showed a modern glass and steel building where the Greek revival had been. I put down my fork. I read it again. I read it a 3rd time. Not because I did not understand it, where I was in the sentence. My brother had just announced to his professional network a development project at my grandmother's address. I had not been called. I had not been sent an email. I had not been mentioned in any capacity. I found out the same way his investors did. I sat there for a while. Then I called Iris. Iris Nakamura had been my colleague at the Historic Preservation Office for 6 years. She was the person I called when I needed to think out loud without being talked at. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "Did you see the Hensley Development post?" She said, "Yeah, I'm sorry, Clara." That was all she said. I appreciated that she did not try to fill the space after it. I called my mother the next morning. I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" My mother said, "It was just a house, Clara. Devin needed a project. Frances would have wanted us to move forward." I had heard variations of that sentence my entire adult life. It came in different shapes, but the structure was always the same. Something was minimized, something was justified by what Frances would have wanted, and the conversation was closed before it began. Frances would have wanted Devin to succeed. Frances would have wanted the family to be practical. Frances would have wanted me not to make things difficult. I said, "She lived there for 41 years. My mother said, "Houses are not people, Clara." I did not argue. I sat with the phone after she hung up, looking out my kitchen window at the street below. The live oak at the corner was still holding its leaves. Savannah oaks do that well into winter. What I found was that I had been waiting for a version of this for a long time. The specific shape of it was new. The feeling underneath was not. I documented buildings for a living. I knew what they held.
The Chatham County Probate Court is on Wright Square, in a building that has been processing records since before the Civil War. I had been there dozens of times for client work. I knew the clerks by name. I knew which terminals were the fastest and which printers jammed. I went on a Wednesday morning, before my first client call. I had not told anyone I was going. There is something specific about reading a family member's probate file in a public courthouse. The documents are available to anyone. There is no protected status, no sealed record, no permission required. You simply request the file, and they bring it to you, and you sit at a table under fluorescent lights, and you read. Frances Hensley had lived in Savannah for over 4 decades and raised a family and sat on 3 neighborhood association boards and attended First Baptist Church on Abercorn every Sunday for 30 years. And now her most intimate decisions were in a manila folder that any stranger could request. I set my bag on the table. I took out the brass measuring tape. I don't know why I brought it that day. It had been sitting in the front pocket of my work bag since I had cleared out some of her things the week after she died, and I had not moved it from there. I set it on the table next to the folder. Then I opened the file. The will was 17 pages. I read it front to back, the way I read survey documents, which is linearly and without skipping. Frances had been specific. She had divided her personal property carefully and without apparent conflict. The jewelry to Patricia, the books to Devon and to me in equal shares. The furniture to be appraised and distributed according to mutual agreement among the surviving family members. And then, on page 11, in a section titled Disposition of Real Property, I found the sentence. What I found was this. Prior to any transfer of the property located at 14 Abercorn Street, Savannah, Georgia, to any third party outside of the immediate family, the property shall be offered to Clara Hensley at independently appraised fair market value with a right of first refusal period of 60 days, with written notice to be delivered to Clara Hensley via certified mail to her current address of record. I read it twice. The language was clear. Before anyone could sell that house to an outside buyer, I had to be offered the chance to purchase it at fair market value, with 60 days to respond, with notice delivered to me personally. I looked at the date. Frances had added this clause 2 years before she died. I sat at that table for a long time. The clerk behind the counter was helping someone else. A woman near the window was going through a file of her own. The fluorescent light hummed. I thought about what it meant that this clause existed. I thought about what it meant that I had not known it existed. I thought about what it meant that Devon had announced his development project on LinkedIn to his entire professional network, and that the groundbreaking had already been scheduled, and that I was sitting in a probate court on a Wednesday morning, finding out about a legal right I had possessed for over a year and a half. At the back of the will, there was a 1-page addendum with the signatures of Frances and 2 witnesses and her attorney. The attorney's name was Margaret Fowler. There was a firm name and a phone number. I wrote both down. I closed the file. I set the brass measuring tape back in my bag. I returned the folder to the clerk. I drove back to my office and sat at my desk, and did not make my first client call on time for the first time in 4 years. That evening I went to the house on Abercorn. The sale had not yet closed. Devon had a key, and I assumed he had been showing the property to his development team. I still had the spare key from under the 3rd porch step, which no one had thought to ask for. I let myself in. The house was the same. Frances had not been gone long enough for any of it to shift. The furniture was still in place, most of it. Her reading chair in the front room, the small table beside it with the lamp she had used for decades. The walls still carried the faint smell of the cedar she had kept in the closets. I went to the bookshelf in the study. Frances had kept everything there that she considered important. Reference books, correspondence, a wooden box of photographs, 2 years of National Geographic that she had meant to read someday. I was not looking for anything specific. I was, I think, just being in the house. The phone number for Margaret Fowler was tucked between the 2nd and 3rd shelves, written on a small piece of cream-colored note card in Frances's handwriting. Beneath the name and number, Frances had written 2 words. For Clara. Stood in the study for a moment, holding that note card. Then I put it in my coat pocket next to the measuring tape and walked back out. I called the USPS tracking portal from my car the next morning. Every piece of certified mail sent through the United States Postal Service has a tracking number. When Devon had sent me the notification required under the right of first refusal clause, that letter would have been assigned one. The probate file included a copy of the certified mail receipt, which included that number. I had photographed everything in the file before I left. I typed the tracking number into the portal. The result came back in less than a second. Certified mail. Sent November of 3 years prior. Delivered. Delivery address listed was 847 Forsyth Street, apartment 3B, Savannah, Georgia. I had not lived at 847 Forsyth Street for 3 years and 2 months. I read further. The line below the delivery status read, Return to sender, address unknown. Dated 11 days after the initial delivery attempt. Devon had sent the notification. He had sent it to the address he had on file for me. That address was 3 years out of date. The letter had gone to the apartment building, found no one named Clara Hensley, and been returned. Devin had checked the box on the form and moved forward. The right of first refusal period had technically run. The house had been listed and sold to Devin's own company. The whole sequence had taken less than 90 days. I sat in my car in the parking lot behind my office building and looked at the tracking information for a long time. What I found was that this was not a secret Devin had been keeping from me. Devin, I was almost certain, did not know any of this had happened. Devin trusted that Patricia had handled the legal aspects of the estate the way Patricia handled everything, efficiently and according to her own priorities. Devin had been told the notifications were sent. Devin had been told the legal requirements were met. Devin had submitted the paperwork his attorney needed and moved forward. The problem was not that Devin had deceived me. The problem was that Patricia had sent the notification to an address she knew was wrong. My mother knew where I lived. She had mailed me a birthday card 7 months before the notification was sent, to the correct address, which I had given her when I moved. She knew the address. She had the address. She had chosen not to update it. I did not call her. I called Margaret Fowler instead. Margaret Fowler's office was on Drayton Street, in a building that had once been a cotton merchant's warehouse and now housed 4 law firms and an accounting practice. She was a compact woman in her late 50s, with round, tortoiseshell glasses and a gray blazer, and the measured precision of someone who had been reading legal documents for 30 years and had learned to trust only what was written down. She shook my hand and offered me coffee, and I said yes, and she poured it without asking how I took it, which I respected. She said, "Your grandmother called me the week she signed this clause. She wanted me to know it existed, and she wanted me to know that you might not find it through the normal channels." I said, "What do you mean by normal channels?" She said, "She meant that if your family handled the estate the way she expected them to, you might not be shown the will directly. She wanted you to have a way to find the clause on your own. So she left my number where she thought you would look." I said, "She knew I would go through her books." Fowler said, "She said you were the only one who ever did." I held my coffee cup and looked at the window behind Fowler's desk. Outside, a delivery van was double parked on Drayton Street. Someone on the sidewalk was arguing with the driver. Fowler said, "She was very clear, your grandmother. She said, 'Clara will find this when she needs it.' And then she told me what to do if you called." I said, "What did she tell you to do?" Fowler set down her pen. She said, "She told me to tell you the truth about the clause and to tell you that the process is straightforward if you follow it correctly. And she said to tell you that she trusted you to know what to do with it." I drove home from Fowler's office in silence. I did not put on the radio. I did not call anyone. My grandmother had not left me a dramatic revelation, left me a letter to be read aloud at a family dinner. She had not arranged for anyone to walk in at the last moment with evidence in an envelope. She had done something quieter than that. She had inserted a clause into a legal document, told her attorney where to find the phone number she was leaving for her granddaughter, and trusted that her granddaughter would know how to use what she found. Frances had been a practical woman. In this way, she and Patricia were alike. The difference was what they had chosen to be practical in service of. I went home and took out my survey notebook and turned to a fresh page. I wrote, 14 Abercorn Street. Then I wrote the ROFR clause verbatim from memory. Then I wrote the USPS tracking result. Then I wrote what Margaret Fowler had told me. Then I looked at the brass measuring tape on my desk. Frances H., 1971. I had one more thing to do before I was ready. I drove to the house on Abercorn on a Saturday morning. The key was still under the 3rd step. The sale to Devin's company was proceeding through escrow. No one was living there. No one had touched the interior since Frances had died, as far as I could tell. I brought my survey kit, the full one, The one I used for landmark nomination work. The clipboard with the pre-printed forms, the digital camera, the notebook, the measuring tape. I brought Francis's brass one as well and clipped it to the outside of the bag where I could reach it. I spent 3 hours in that house. I measured every room, every door frame, every window opening. I documented the original plaster ceiling medallions in the parlor and the intact pine flooring throughout the main level, and the cast iron fireplace surrounds and the hand-turned newel post on the staircase. I photographed the ironwork on the front gate, which was original to the 1856 construction and had never been replaced. I noted the intact transom windows above each exterior door. I recorded the foundation type and the roof line and the placement of the exterior chimneys. I had done this work dozens of times for other people's buildings. I had submitted landmark nomination applications for 11 properties in Savannah's historic district over the course of my career. I knew what the Savannah Historic Preservation Commission required, and I knew which criteria 14 Abercorn Street met. What I found was that I had already written most of the report. Every building I had ever assessed in this neighborhood, I had noted 14 Abercorn in comparison. I had referenced it in 3 different client reports as an example of intact Greek Revival residential construction. I had photographs dating back 8 years. I had the SHPC's own documentation of the property from a 1994 survey. I sat on the front steps of the house when I was done. The morning was cold and the street was quiet. A woman walked a dog past without looking up. A car turned onto the block and slowed to look at the house and then drove on. I took out the brass measuring tape and held it. The weight of it was familiar. It had been in my hands on more buildings than I could count. I went back to my office and spent the rest of the weekend writing the landmark designation application. I submitted it to the SHPC on Monday morning. The groundbreaking was scheduled for Friday. Under SHPC protocol, any pending landmark application for a property in the historic district requires the presence of a field officer at any ground disturbance event for that property. The application was registered in the public record the moment I filed it. I did not call Devin. I did not call Patricia. I filed the paperwork. That was the job. If you have ever done the work and been told the work didn't count, stay with me, because the next part is where everything that had been dismissed came back into use. I called Devin on a Tuesday evening. I had thought about how to approach this conversation for several days. I had considered not making it at all, going straight to the legal process without contact. But I wanted to know something first. Devin picked up on the 3rd ring. He sounded like he was in his car, the way he usually sounded when I called, which was not often. He said, "Hey, Clara, what's up?" I said, "Devin, did you know there was a right of first refusal clause in Francis's will for the Abercorn property?" There was a pause. Not a long one, but the kind that comes before a sentence a person is not prepared to give. He said, "What clause?" "Mom handled all the legal stuff with the estate. Why?" I said, "So you didn't know it existed?" He said, "Clara, what are you talking about? Is there a problem with the title?" I said, "I know she did. I'll talk to you soon." I ended the call. I sat with that for a while. Devin had not been lying. I had heard enough people lie in professional settings to know the difference between evasion and genuine confusion. Devin was genuinely confused. He had submitted paperwork to his attorney. His attorney had confirmed the legal requirements were met. He had moved forward. There was a specific clause requiring personal notification to me, because Patricia had not told him. What I found was that this was somehow worse than if Devin had known. Devin had not deceived me. Devin had simply not looked. He had let Patricia handle it, the way everyone had always let Patricia handle things. And Patricia had handled it according to her own priorities, and Devin had never asked a single question. He had built a development project on my grandmother's property without a single phone call to me, because he had trusted that someone else had taken care of the details. That is a very specific kind of not looking. It is the kind that requires no malice and produces the same result. I did not call him back that night. The second meeting with Margaret Fowler was different from the first. The first had been orientation. This one was documentation. Fowler had prepared a formal letter on firm letterhead summarizing the findings. She walked me through it line by line, the way a good attorney does when they want to make sure you understand what you are signing. The letter stated that the right of first refusal clause in the last will and testament of Frances Ann Hensley, Chatham County Probate Court File number 2024-0312, required written notification to Clara Ann Hensley via certified mail to her current address of record prior to any transfer of the property at 14 Abercorn Street to any third party. The letter further stated that the certified mail notification sent on behalf of Devin Hensley in November of the prior year had been addressed to 847 Forsyth Street, Apartment 3B, Savannah, Georgia, which had not been the current address of record for Clara Ann Hensley for a period of 3 years and 2 months prior to the mailing. The letter further stated that under Georgia probate law, notification sent to a known incorrect address does not constitute proper service. Fowler set her pen on the desk and looked at me over her glasses. She said, "This is a clear violation of the clause. The notification was not properly served. The right of first refusal period has not legally run." I said, "What does that mean in practical terms?" She said, "It means the transfer of the property to Hensley Development was not executed in compliance with the terms of the will. You have legal standing to challenge the transfer. You also have, at minimum, the right to be offered the property at independently appraised value with a 60-day response period." I said, "And if I don't want to buy it?" She said, "That is your right, but the option has to be formally offered with proper notice before the transfer can be considered complete under the terms of the will." I picked up the formal letter and folded it and put it in the folder I had brought. I put the folder in my bag. I picked up the brass measuring tape from the table where I had set it. Fowler said, "Your grandmother was very thorough." I said, "She measured twice." Fowler's expression did not change, but something in it settled. She said, "Yes, that is one way to put it." I drove home in the dark. The city was quiet the way Savannah gets on weekday evenings in January. The streets mostly empty, the live oaks making their shapes against the sky. I passed the corner of Abercorn and Gaston and slowed without meaning to. The house was dark. Devin had not put up any construction fencing yet. The ironwork gates were closed. The magnolia tree in the side yard, which Frances had planted the year she moved in, was still there. I drove on. The Thursday before the groundbreaking, I checked the SHPC online portal from my laptop at my kitchen table. The landmark designation application for 14 Abercorn Street was listed as pending review, assigned to Field Officer James Okafor, with a notation that the officer was scheduled to attend the ground disturbance event for the property on Friday at 10 in the morning. This was standard procedure. Any property with a pending application in the historic district required officer presence at any demolition or ground disturbance activity. The portal was public. Anyone could see it. Devin could have checked this portal at any point in the preceding 48 hours. Devin had not checked it. I was not surprised by this. Devin dealt in spreadsheets and renderings and investor meetings. He did not, in my experience, read Preservation Commission portals. I texted Iris, "You going Friday?" She replied within a minute, "Yeah, routine assignment, Okafor's lead." I wrote, "Come early, second row if you can." She wrote, "Already planned. You want company after?" I wrote, "Maybe." I closed the laptop and sat at my kitchen table for a while. The folder with the USPS tracking records and Fowler's letter was on the table. The brass measuring tape was beside it. I had laid them out the way I laid out survey materials the night before a major assessment, organized, accessible, ready. What I found was that I was not nervous. I had expected to feel something closer to dread or to the kind of anxious energy that precedes a confrontation. Instead, I felt what I usually felt the night before a significant field day, which was a quiet readiness. Everything was documented, everything was in order. The only variable was how the other people in the room would behave, and that had never been something I could control anyway. I put the folder in my work bag. I put the measuring tape in my coat pocket. I went to bed at 10:30 and slept without difficulty. I went to the house on Abercorn one more time before the groundbreaking. It was Wednesday, the day after I had spoken with Devon, the day after I had confirmed the SHPC portal. I went in the early evening, after my last client call, when the light was low and gold and came in sideways through the front windows. I was not there to assess anything. I had already completed the survey. I was there because I had not said goodbye properly. I went through each room the way Frances had walked me through them the first time she had shown me the house as a child. The front parlor with its plaster medallion and the 12-foot ceilings. The dining room with the pocket doors. The kitchen that had been updated in the 1980s and then not touched again. The study with the bookshelves where I had found the note card. The bedroom upstairs where Frances had slept until she could not climb the stairs anymore and had moved to the first-floor guest room. I sat in the reading chair in the front room for a few minutes. The light came through the shutters and made long, thin lines across the pine floor. The chair still held the shape of the person who had sat in it for 4 decades. I thought about what Devon's rendering had shown in its place. A modern structure with clean lines and a glass facade. It was not an ugly building the way he had drawn it. Devon had good taste in the visual sense. It was just not this building. It was not the magnolia in the yard or the ironwork on the gate, or the plaster that had been applied to these walls in 1856 and had never been touched since. The measuring marks Frances had made in pencil on the doorframe of the kitchen, recording the heights of 2 children across 12 years. I stood up from the chair. I took out the brass measuring tape. I measured the width of the front window one more time, the way Frances had taught me. Pull tight at both ends. The measurement matched the survey I had submitted to the SHPC. I locked the door behind me and put the key back under the 3rd step. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. I had done my grieving for Frances in the months after she died, quietly, in the normal way. What I felt in that house that evening was not grief. It was closer to the feeling you have when a piece of work is finished and you have done it right. A settling. I walked back to my car. I drove home. I made dinner. I went to bed. The day before the groundbreaking, I drove to Devon's house to pick up some of Frances's furniture that had been stored there temporarily. Patricia had arranged this. I had called ahead and Devon had said he would leave the garage code. The house was empty when I arrived. I loaded the boxes into my car. Before I locked the garage, I went back for the last box, which had been pushed to the back of a shelf and which I nearly missed. It was a wooden box, the kind used for keepsakes, small enough to carry with one hand. I recognized it. Frances had kept it in her study. It there many times over the years, but had never asked about the contents because it was one of those objects that communicates clearly without any words that it belongs to someone specifically and is not for general inquiry. I put it in the car. That evening at my kitchen table, I opened it. Inside were photographs, some letters, a small collection of postcards from places Frances had visited with my grandfather in the 1970s. The photographs I set aside without looking at closely. The letters I sorted by date. Near the bottom of the box was an envelope I recognized. It was from my mother. I could tell by the return address and by the way Patricia addressed envelopes, which was in a precise printed hand that I had seen on birthday cards and legal correspondence my entire life. I should not have read it. Or rather, I read it knowing that Frances had kept it in this box, in this house, and had left me alone to go through this box, and had not marked anything in it as private. Frances made her intentions clear through structure rather than direct statement. She had left the box accessible. I read the letter. My mother had written it 2 years before Frances died. It was typed, printed on plain paper, formal and measured. The central sentence read, "Clara has always needed more support than Devon because she never chose a path with clear financial outcomes. She needs to find her own path. Stop enabling her." Below the letter, folded together as though they belonged to the same document, was a note card in Frances's handwriting. 3 lines. The note card had never been mailed. Frances had written a response to my mother's letter and then kept it in the box instead of sending it. The note card said, "I know what you see when you look at Clara. I see something different. She already has. You just haven't looked." I sat at my kitchen table with both pieces of paper for a long time. My mother had been arguing about me. Frances had answered for me, quietly, without telling me she had been asked. What I found was that I had not needed Frances to defend me. I had not needed her to argue on my behalf or to correct my mother or to intervene in any way. But she had done something that mattered more than any of that. She had seen me clearly when I was standing right in front of her, and she had written it down. She had seen me clearly, and she had trusted it enough to build a legal clause around it. She had not left me money or property or a dramatic gesture. She left me the same thing she had always given me. Her honest assessment of what she found when she looked carefully at the structure in front of her. I folded both pieces of paper and put them back in the box. I closed the lid. The brass measuring tape was on the table where I had set it when I came in. I picked it up and held it for a moment. Then I put it in my coat pocket, where it would stay until Friday morning. If any part of this is familiar to you, if you have ever watched a family make a decision that affected your life without asking you, then you already know the feeling I am describing. I will tell you what happened at the groundbreaking. There were 4 of them. Books, mostly, and a few framed photographs. In the 3rd room down the hall, Devon's daughter Zoe had left her bedroom door open. Zoe was 11. She liked to draw, the way Devon had liked to draw when we were young. On the wall above her desk, she had taped up several of her drawings. Most of them were animals and scenes from what looked like a fantasy world she had invented. One of them was a building. It was done in colored pencil, detailed in the way that 11-year-olds who are serious about drawing are detailed. It showed a tall, modern structure with glass and clean lines, surrounded by palm trees. At the top of the drawing, in her careful block lettering, Zoe had written, "Grandma's new house." Below that, she had written, "My new condo someday." I stood in the doorway of that room for a moment. Zoe had been told something about this project. She had been told it was exciting. She had drawn it the way you draw things you are looking forward to, with attention and care. I did not go into the room. I looked at the drawing for a moment longer, and then I walked back down the hall and loaded the last box into my car. Zoe had not done anything wrong. Zoe was 11 years old and had been given a version of events that made sense to her and had made a drawing about it. That is what children do. What happens to adults around them is not their doing. I sat in the car in Devon's driveway for a minute. Then I drove home. That night, I thought about what my mother had said when I was growing up, in the years when I was beginning to understand what my work was. She had said it several times, always with what I took to be a kind of fond dismissal. "You're the one who saves the past." She said it like she was describing a personality trait, like being left-handed or preferring cold weather. It was just what Clara did. I had not said it as a criticism, I had not taken it as one. But sitting in my car in the dark in January, I understood that she had also not said it as a strength. She had said it as a category. Clara saves the past, Devon builds the future. These were different things, and one of them was more practical than the other. And practicality was what the family had always measured itself by. If you have spent any time watching someone take something that mattered and reduce it to a line in a ledger, you know what I mean by this. It is not always dramatic, it is not always malicious, Sometimes it is just the cost of doing business with people who have decided that sentiment is a form of inefficiency. I had watched my grandmother's house become a line in Devon's ledger. I had watched my grandmother's right of first refusal clause become a notification sent to a wrong address. I had watched the house where I had learned my trade become a rendering in a LinkedIn post. And I had documentation of all of it. Stay with me, because this is where the story starts to move in a different direction. The groundbreaking was scheduled for 10 in the morning on a Friday in January. I arrived at 9:45. 14 Abercorn Street was 2 blocks from my office. I had walked past it hundreds of times in the course of my work. I knew the way the morning light came in from the east and fell across the ironwork gate. I knew the sound the front steps made in cold weather. I knew which magnolia branch hung lowest in the side yard and scraped the fence when the wind moved it. I came around the corner and saw the setup from a block away. The folding tables with the white tablecloths, the small crowd already gathering, excavator at the edge of the property, engine running. Carter Briggs in his dark suit near the podium, checking his phone. A photographer from what looked like one of the local papers. Several people I did not recognize who had the energy of investors, which is a specific kind of patient attention. Devon was speaking to 2 of them near the gate when I arrived. He did not see me come in. I found a place in the 3rd row and set my bag down at my feet. The folder was inside. The brass measuring tape was in my coat pocket. A few minutes later, Iris appeared beside me in the 2nd row and gave me one nod. She was wearing her HPO jacket, the one with the office seal on the chest. She had a notebook and a pen. She looked like what she was, which was a preservation office field officer attending a routine ground disturbance event. James Okafor from SHPC arrived at 9:55. He was in a dark blazer with his SHPC badge on the lapel. He was carrying a folder. He positioned himself to the right of the small crowd, near the front, which was exactly where a field officer would stand at this kind of event. Devon called the group to attention at 10 o'clock. He thanked everyone for coming. He thanked Carter Briggs by name, and Briggs acknowledged this with a small nod. Devon spoke about the Savannah Historic District, about the responsibility that came with developing in a neighborhood of this significance, about the balance between preservation and progress. He used the word heritage 3 times. He spoke about his grandmother and her decades in this home and the values she had passed to the family. He said she had always believed that a building should earn its place in a neighborhood by what it offered to the people around it. Then he said his grandmother's house would become that kind of building. He said the new structure would honor the spirit of what had come before, while offering Savannah something the neighborhood had been missing. I had heard this kind of language many times in my career. It is the language developers use in historic districts when they need approvals. It does not always mean anything beyond the approvals. Devon turned to the excavator operator and gave a small nod to indicate they were ready to begin. James Okafor stepped forward. He said, "Before we proceed, there is a pending landmark designation application filed 2 days ago for this property at 14 Abercorn Street. Standard procedure requires the SHPC to complete its review before any demolition permit can be authorized for a property with a pending application in the historic district. We cannot authorize ground disturbance today." Devon's smile arrived before his understanding did. It was the reflex smile of a man who has never had an event go unexpectedly wrong and cannot yet process that this one has. He said, "I think there may have been some kind of administrative mistake. We have all our permits in order." James Okafor said, "The permits are not in question, Mr. Hensley. The landmark application was filed on Wednesday and registered in the public record the same day. Our presence here today is required under standard protocol. There is no administrative error." Devon's smile faded. His face went white. Carter Briggs lowered his phone, raising it to take a photo of the first ground being broken. He looked at Devon with an expression I recognized from boardrooms and review meetings. The expression of a man who has invested a significant amount of money and is now recalibrating his confidence in the person who asked him to do so. Briggs said, "Is the title clean, Devon?" Devon turned slightly toward where Patricia was standing. Patricia had gone very still. Devin said, "We had all the legal clearances. Mom handled the estate notifications." Briggs said, "Devin, is the title clean?" There was a silence. The excavator operator had cut his engine. The photographer lowered his camera, up my bag. I walked to the front of the group. I said, "My name is Clara Hensley. I'm Frances Hensley's granddaughter and a licensed architectural historian. I'd like to take 2 minutes." No one told me to stop. What I found was this. I said, "Frances Hensley's will contained a right of first refusal clause for this property. The clause required that before 14 Abercorn Street could be sold to any third party outside the immediate family, I had to be offered the property at independently appraised value, with 60 days written notice delivered to my current address via certified mail." I opened the folder and took out the first document. I said, "The certified mail notification was sent to 847 Forsyth Street, apartment 3B. That address had not been current for me for 3 years and 2 months at the time of mailing. The letter was returned to sender. I have the USPS tracking records." I placed the tracking document on the portable podium. Devin was looking at it. His expression had moved past the smile and past the confusion into something quieter. The expression of a person who was beginning to understand a sequence of events they had not previously been aware of. I said, "Under Georgia probate law, notification sent to a known incorrect address does not constitute proper service. The right of first refusal period has not legally run. The transfer of this property to Hensley Development was not executed in compliance with the terms of the will." I took out the second document, the letter from Margaret Fowler, and set it beside the first. My mother said, "Clara, this isn't the place for this." She said it quietly. She said it the way she said most things, without obvious emotion, with the tone of a person managing a situation. I looked at her. I said, "I know what this is, Mom. I documented buildings for 15 years. I know what holds." I had the brass measuring tape in my coat pocket. I did not take it out. I did not need to, but I could feel the weight of it. Carter Briggs was reading the Fowler letter. He had picked it up from the podium without asking permission, and was reading it with the focused attention of someone who has spent a career evaluating risk. After a moment, he said to Devin, "I'm going to need to talk to my attorney." He handed the letter back to me, not to Devin, which was its own kind of statement. Then he took his phone out and walked away from the group toward the sidewalk. 2 of the other investors followed him. Devin was still looking at the USPS tracking document on the podium. Patricia was looking at nothing in particular, at a point in the middle distance that held no specific object. The excavator operator was talking to his colleague quietly, waiting. James Okafor said, "We'll be in touch about the review timeline for the landmark application, Mr. Hensley. You'll receive written notice." He nodded to me. I nodded back. He walked toward Iris and they spoke briefly in the professional shorthand of people who work the same processes from different offices. Devin said, finally, quietly, "Clara." I looked at him. He was looking at the documents on the podium. He said, still quietly, "Did you know about this when you called me last week?" I said, "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "I wanted to know what you knew." He did not have an answer for that. He picked up the documents and looked at them for a moment, and then set them back down. The photographer had put away his camera. The small crowd had dispersed into groups of 2 and 3, people talking quietly near the sidewalk, near their cars. Devin looked at the excavator. The operator had shut the engine off completely now and was sitting with his arms folded, waiting for instruction that was not going to come. Devin said, "The groundbreaking is off." No one said anything. I picked up my folder. I put the documents back in it. Bag. I pulled the strap over my shoulder and looked at the house one more time. The ironwork on the gate. The magnolia in the yard. The plaster above the front door with its decorative keystone, intact since 1856. My mother had not moved. She was still standing where she had been, looking at nothing. I did not go to her. I had not expected to, and she had not expected me to. We understood each other on this particular point, Patricia and I. We had always understood each other better than we had been able to say. I walked to where Iris was standing. She fell into step beside me as I turned toward the street. At the corner, before I turned onto Gaston, I passed a framed photograph mounted inside the lobby window of the neighboring building. A photo of the historic streetscape from the 1930s. Frances was not in it. The photograph was from before her time, but the ironwork on the gate at 14 Abercorn was visible in the background. The same ironwork that was still there this morning. I kept walking. 2 weeks after the groundbreaking, Margaret Fowler, Devon, and I met at Fowler's office on Drayton Street. Devon had brought his own attorney, a woman named Rachel Sims, who worked in real estate law and had a reputation for being efficient and unemotional, which I respected. Devon had not looked at me when he came in. He had looked at the table, at Fowler, at Sims, at the documents, not at me. I did not require him to. The terms were straightforward. Fowler had outlined them in a letter sent in advance. The property would be offered to me at independently appraised fair market value, as required by the clause. A certified appraiser had assessed 14 Abercorn Street. The appraised value was $1,400,000. Devon would purchase the right of first refusal option from the estate at the appraised price, meaning his company would transfer that sum to the estate account, from which the will's distribution would then proceed normally. In practical terms, Devon would pay the appraised value into the estate. I would then decide whether to exercise my right to purchase. If I chose to purchase, I would receive the property at that price, and Devon would be reimbursed from the estate. If I chose not to purchase, the estate would distribute the proceeds according to the will, and Devon would be free to reacquire the property from the estate at the same price. Sims asked whether I intended to exercise the right of first refusal. I looked at the appraisal report. $1.4 million for a house I did not have $1.4 million to spend. I said, "No, I won't be exercising the right to purchase." What I found was that this had never been about buying the house. I could not have bought it. I had known that from the beginning. Frances had known that probably when she wrote the clause. It had always been about something else. Devon signed the paperwork without looking up. When he was done, he put the pen down and finally looked at me. He said, "I didn't know about the clause, Clara." I said, "I know." He said, "Mom told me the notifications were taken care of." I said, "I know that too." We sat there for a moment. There was nothing else to say, not in a law office with 2 attorneys present, not about the things that actually mattered. The things that actually mattered were not in the documents. Devon stood and put on his coat. At the door, he paused. "What are you going to do with the money?" He meant the distribution from the estate, my share of the proceeds after the correct process was followed. I said, "I haven't decided yet." He left. Sims left. Fowler gathered the signed documents into a neat stack. She said, "Your grandmother would be satisfied." I said, "I think she would have expected it." Fowler smiled, small and precise. She said, "Yes, that is exactly the right word." My mother did not call. Not that day, not the week after, not the month after. I had not expected her to. Patricia was not a woman who called to discuss outcomes she had not anticipated. She would recalibrate. She would find her footing. She would eventually, in some form, reach out. That was its own kind of certainty. But I did not need it right now, and she knew I did not need it. And in that particular way, we were still perfectly understood between us. 2 months after the groundbreaking, I received a letter from the Savannah Historic Preservation Commission. The landmark designation for 14 Abercorn Street had been approved. The letter outlined what this meant in legal terms. The property was now on the Savannah Register of Historic Places, which meant that any future owner would be subject to SHPC review and approval before undertaking any exterior alteration or demolition of the structure. The ironwork gate, the plaster medallions, the cast iron fireplace surrounds, the hand-turned newel post, the transom windows, all of it was now formally protected. Devon could still sell the house. He could still profit from the sale, but he could not tear it down. Not now. Barring an extraordinary legal process that would take years and would require him to demonstrate that preservation was an undue hardship, a standard that was very difficult to meet for a structurally sound building in good repair. The house would stand. I sat with that letter at my kitchen table for a while. Then I called Iris. She said, "Yeah?" I said, "The landmark came through." She said, "Yeah, I saw it in the portal this morning." I said, "Did you expect it?" She said, "Did you?" I said, "Yes, the structure was intact. The documentation was thorough." She said, "Then yeah." That was the end of the conversation. That was all it needed to be. On a Saturday in late February, I drove to Abercorn Street. The sale of the property had not yet closed. Devon was in the process of listing it on the open market. Under the new landmark designation, he had already updated the listing materials. The ironwork and the plaster medallions were now described as features rather than obstacles. I parked on the street and sat in my car for a moment. The morning was warmer than January, the kind of Savannah morning in late winter that reminds you that spring is an event here rather than a gradual shift. The magnolia in the side yard had started to show the first small signs of growth. The live oaks along the street were beginning to fill in again. I let myself in with the spare key, which I had not yet returned. I would return it, I had told myself. I was not ready yet. The house was the same as it had always been. No one had started any work on it. The furniture was still there, most of it, waiting for the estate distribution to sort out who went where. Francis's reading chair was still in the front room. The lamp was still beside it. I sat down on the floor of the front parlor, not in the chair. The floor was more honest. The pine boards creaked slightly as I shifted. The morning light came through the shutters in long, thin lines, the same way it had the last time I was here. I took the brass measuring tape out of my coat pocket. Francis H., 1971. The engraving was worn smooth on one edge from decades of hands. I held it the way she had taught me to hold it, lightly but with intent. I thought about what Francis had done. She had not saved me from anything. She had not swooped in with money or lawyers or dramatic intervention. She had written a sentence into a legal document. She had told her attorney where to leave a phone number. She had trusted that I would find both, and that I would know what to do. She had not been certain. She had only trusted that I had learned what she had tried to teach me, which was not about historic preservation specifically, but about something else that preservation is a practice of, which is this. You look at a thing carefully. You measure it honestly. You document what you find. And then you let the structure itself make the argument. The structure holds or it doesn't. You can't make it hold if it's done. And if it holds, you don't need to force anything. You just need to make what's true visible to the people who are deciding. That was the whole of it. That was what she had left me. I set the measuring tape on the pine floor beside me and looked at the room. The plaster medallion on the ceiling, the 12-foot height, the light coming in at its specific angle. After a while, I stood up. I took out my notebook. I did what I always did at the start of a new assessment. I dated the top of the page, wrote the address, and started writing down what I observed. 14 Abercorn Street, Savannah, Georgia, Saturday morning, late February. Condition, stable. Structure, intact. Recommended action, maintain. I picked up the measuring tape and put it back in my coat pocket. I measured the width of the front window one last time. The measurement matched the survey. It matched the SHPC documentation. It matched the records going back to 1887. I wrote the number in my notebook. I closed it. I put the pen in my pocket beside the measuring tape. I had spent 15 years measuring other people's houses. I had documented their histories and assessed their conditions and argued for their preservation in front of review boards and city councils and the occasional skeptical property owner who did not yet understand what they had. Now I knew what this one held.